It's been nearly 3 decades since the unsolved murder of 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey, a case that captivated the nation. And even though her parents always denied any involvement in her death, it took 12 years for prosecutors to exonerate JonBenét's mother and her father.
Now a new Netflix documentary is shining a spotlight on the case once again, as sources tell ABC News progress is being made in the investigation. Nightline co-anchor Byron Pitts sat down with JonBenét's father, John Ramsey, to talk about his daughter and the search to find her killer.
God willing, they find the person's responsible for your daughter's death. What would you want to say to them?
Certainly, why did you do this? I just want this chapter closed for the benefit of my family.
So hard there. Byron joins us now. And I'm curious, does John Ramsey really think they're ever going to get an answer as to who did this?
He does. He's 80 years old. He thought for years it might not happen in his lifetime, but he's optimistic because of all the advances in technology that they will find the killer in his lifetime.
So how much of an impact could public attention play in this case? I mean, you look at the Menendez brothers.
Sure. I mean, we all understand the value of public pressure, media pressure in departments. Boulder has a new police chief who can approach this, with a clean slate. There are a number of resources available to them, not so much government resources, but private labs that have the technology that they argue there's enough physical evidence that exists that they could lead to the killer.
The police accept help from outside their system. That's been the flaw for 25 years.
You're advocating, you've been asking for the Boulder police to use new technology to retest some of the DNA in the case. And what is the response?
Well, for 25 years, in my judgment, the police department was very contained, very poor leadership. We don't need help, stay out of our way, stay out of our business, which is tragic. They had no experience. The fellow investigated our case for 25 years was an auto theft investigator before he took this case over. And frankly, it was a roadblock. So that's very frustrating. They wouldn't accept help from the outside. I never criticized them for not having experience. I criticized them for refusing help from people that did, and it was offered. We're hopeful now with the new police chief that was brought in from the outside, which was huge, that he will exercise good leadership and accept help from people that have offered it. To my knowledge, they have not worked with federal agencies. They have not worked with anybody outside of their group, and there's been so much offered. But the way our system works in this country, the police department, the police chief is in charge of his case, and if he doesn't want anybody to come in and look at it, they can't come in.
And circumstance isn't weak. It can close cases, but it works only if the lines converge tight enough that no other story makes sense. And that's where this case gets brutal, because here the lines split. They don't collapse into a single point. They fan out into parallel theories, family involvement, or intruder, and each theory has just enough fuel to keep burning. For the police, the challenge was never simply someone in that house did it. That wasn't enough. The challenge was, which person, which act, what intent, and what sequence. Circumstantial only convicts when you can connect those dots without gaps. Miss one link, and the whole picture fractures. That's why this case is hard. Not because there's nothing, but because the evidence cuts both ways, like broken glass. But here's the meta layer, something that's just as powerful as the crime scene itself. Public opinion was never neutral in this case. From day one, it was hijacked by theatrical object, the ransom note. 3 pages of handwriting, bizarrely long, riddled with references that sounded half movie, half threat. It was a voice of the outsider, the enemy breaching a domestic world. And people responded to it like they were watching a drama unfold. The note wasn't just evidence, it was theater. That's why the Ramsey case embedded itself into American culture in a way other crimes didn't. The note gave it a villain, a faceless intruder who could be anyone, your neighbor, a stranger in the night, a shadow figure. It let the public project fear outward, away from the family circle. And yet, at the same time, the absence of intruder evidence in the locked house, the missing signs of forced entry pulled suspicion back inward. So the narrative became a tug of war. Did the voice of the note represent a real outside force? Or was it a mask for something that happened inside those walls? And that's what makes this case still burn today. We're not just analyzing crime scene fragments. We're analyzing narrative control. How the family presented itself. How police split internally. How the media amplified whichever version played best on television. The ransom note turned a Colorado crime scene into a national stage, and everyone watching became part of the jury that would never be seated. So when we reset the case, we're not starting from scratch. We're starting from two forces in collision: a legal system that demands direct proof and a cultural system that thrives on theatrical mystery. In that gap lies the Ramsey paradox, the riddle that refuses to close. The stakes are this: if you follow only the legal route, the case looks empty. No indictment, no trial, no closure. But if you follow the circumstantial web, you see patterns that point toward both possible directions and force you to ask which side you trust more: the fragments of science or the weight of human behavior. This isn't just about what happened in a basement in 1996. It's about how we, as a society, process crime, guilt, and innocence when the hard evidence fails and all that's left is performance, perception, and fear. That's the ground we're on. And it's shaky. Patsy Ramsey said she discovered the note at the bottom of the back staircase. She described it as lying on one of the wooden steps, spread out neatly, pages arranged in sequence. 3 full sheets, not crumpled, not torn, not hidden. The way she described it almost sounded deliberate, like it was placed to be found, not dropped in panic. She said she picked it up, saw the words, and immediately understood the threat. But right here, the first cracks appear. Patsy gave 2 different versions of that moment. In one, she said the door near the staircase was closed. In another, she said it was ajar. That might seem minor, but it matters. Closed means sealed off, secure. Ajar means disturbed, recently used. 2 very different implications about whether someone came or went. The inconsistency reveals something deeper in memory shaped after the fact, or narrative tuned for effect. Then there's the light. According to her statement, she didn't turn it on. She claimed she read the ransom note in low light, at that early hour, with her glasses still upstairs. Anyone who's tried to read a grocery receipt in dim hallway light knows how difficult that is. Yet she said she didn't even read the entire note, just skimmed, enough to grasp the threat. But later, in interviews, she recited large chunks of the note almost verbatim. Where did that recall come from if she hadn't read it through that morning? That contradiction never resolves. Handling the note itself is another paradox. Neither John nor Patsy left identifiable fingerprints on it. For a 3-page handwritten document, picked up and carried, that absence is glaring. Law enforcement found prints from the officer who later handled it, but none from the people who claimed to first hold it. John later explained this away by saying, she had the note. But that phrasing is slippery. Did he mean possession, like it was in her hand? Or had she been responsible for it, the one who first noticed? His language doesn't match the forensic record. He says she touched it. The evidence says she didn't. By the time police arrived, the note wasn't on the stairs anymore. It was lying flat on the floor, near the entry. Officers described it there, not on a step. That movement is never fully explained. Who set it down? Who decided it belonged on the floor instead of left as discovered? A critical piece of evidence was displaced before it was even documented. And here's the subtle but devastating point. If Patsy truly found a ransom note threatening her daughter's life, the natural instinct would be to protect it as evidence, place it on a table, show it directly to the police. Instead, the note's shady begins with confusion, inconsistent placement, and 0 clean prints. The note itself is bizarre. 3 pages, written with a Sharpie pen from inside the Ramsey home, on a legal pad from the Ramsey kitchen. No real criminal leaves a novel behind. It quotes movies, it uses odd phrasing like "don't try to grow a brain." It asks for the exact figure of $118,000, the same amount as John's bonus that year. The writing style is theatrical, but the paradox goes deeper. Patsy often spoke about the note in interviews as if it were an external invader, a hostile voice that inserted itself into their domestic world. She called it the longest letter I've ever seen, emphasizing the unnatural length, the strangeness. She described how her eyes caught phrases like "we have your daughter." But her descriptions shift over time. Sometimes she says she couldn't read it fully. Other times, she gives details no casual glance could retain. John, for his part, consistently said Patsy had the note. That phrase recurs. It reveals possession but blurs agency. He never says, "Patsy, read it." He doesn't say, "Patsy gave it to me." He places her in ownership of the evidence without clarifying her actions. Linguistically, it's distancing. Almost as if the note belonged to her, not him. This subtle framing matters because in forensic linguistics, the way people assign possession often reflects subconscious positioning. If you chart the note's physical reality versus the Ramsey's narrative, you see 2 divergent maps. Physical record, note on floor, no prints from the Ramseys. Written with their pen and pad. The officer arrives and sees it displaced. Narrative record, Patsy finds note on stairs. Describes door as closed ajar, doesn't read fully yet recalls exact phrases later. John says, she had the note. Those 2 maps don't overlap, and when 2 versions of evidence refuse to match, investigators have to ask, which is more reliable? The physical evidence, or the witness memory? In most cases, physical wins. But in Boulder, the investigators were split. Some accepted the family narrative, others doubted it. That split fractured the case from the first hour. Why does the ransom note matter so much? Because it's not just a piece of evidence, it's a stage prop. It turned the crime into a drama, with a script written in someone's hand inside that house. For the public, the note shouted intruder. For skeptics, it whispered cover. That tension has never resolved. And that's the paradox. The note is both too much and not enough. Too long, too detailed, too theatrical to be real. And yet not enough in forensic terms. No usable prints, no DNA that ties directly to a hand. It sits at the center of the Ramsey case like a mirror, reflecting whatever theory you bring to it. But if the note is theater, who was the intended audience? The police, the media, or was it, more chillingly, the Ramseys themselves, crafting the first draft of the story they wanted the world to believe? When analysts first broke down the ransom note, they didn't just look at the handwriting, they looked at the writing itself. Foster, one of the early text analysts, dissected syntax, punctuation, and overall style. The note overflows with exclamation points. Don't try to grow a brain, John! A sign of emotional overkill. Sentences swing from clip to sprawling. Some phrases sound almost juvenile, others lean into a Fox military register. This clash of tones is unusual. Real ransom notes are typically blunt, functional, and short. This one reads like someone trying too hard to sound dangerous. But here's the key: this wasn't a forensic handwriting examination. It was textual analysis. That matters. Handwriting can sometimes tie to a writer with measurable certainty. Syntax and style, on the other hand, are far more debatable. One analyst sees theatrical excess. Another sees deliberate camouflage. And because of that, the textual fingerprint of the note has always remained controversial. Still, certain markers stand out. The directive, listen carefully, shows up early in the note. That phrase isn't random. It mirrors law enforcement language often found in FBI training manuals and true crime books. Investigators later pointed out that the Ramsey home contained the book Mindhunter, which itself uses similar phrasing in recounting real ransom and hostage scenarios. Was the author unconsciously borrowing, or consciously staging? Either way, the coincidence undermines the illusion of originality. Other stylistic tells compound the oddity. Overuse of cliches. Pseudo-formal closings, victory, SBTC, and movie-style threats hint at someone immersed in pop culture more than criminal tradecraft. Foster argued that this stylistic layering revealed a voice trying to project toughness but betraying insecurity. Almost like someone writing for an audience rather than under real pressure. But again, the limits are clear. Textual fingerprints can suggest patterns, but they cannot convict. Critics of Foster's work noted that exclamation points and borrowed phrases appear across countless texts, and without a verified control sample from a suspect, the comparisons float in ambiguity. What remains is less a signature than a shadow, a document that feels homemade, patched together from cultural fragments, pointing inward toward the household bookshelf rather than outward toward a professional kidnapper. And that's where the paradox sharpens. The ransom note doesn't just say, intruder. In its syntax, punctuation, and borrowed phrasing, it leaves the possibility that the author was someone already inside, piecing together a voice meant to sound like the outside world. What's striking is how quickly the note was accepted as truth. Patsy said she read only a few lines, enough to see, "We have your daughter." And then she screamed. Within seconds, the household moved under the assumption that JonBenét was gone, taken outside those walls. The reflex was instant. The note was not just read, it was believed. That speed is important. A rational chain of behavior in that moment should have looked different. Turn on the light. Read the entire document, word for word, to understand exactly what was being demanded. Call out your daughter's name. Move through the house room by room, the bedroom, Burke's room, the kitchen, the playroom, the basement systematically, searching for any sign she might still be there. Those are the instinctive actions of parents who fear a child is missing. But they didn't happen. The note, not the evidence of the house, became the authority. And here lies the paradox at the center of the Ramsey case. The note declared abduction, an external hand reaching in. Yet the body of JonBenét was later found inside the house, in a basement room. The note pointed outward, reality pointed inward. That gap between text and truth is the reason the ransom note has always carried suspicion. The believe the note reflex is not a crime in itself, but it raises questions. Was it panic, so blinding that reason collapsed? Was it performance, a choice to behave as though the note was authentic, even while doubts existed? Or was it something darker, acceptance of a script that someone in the house already knew was fiction? As 120pay20 voiceover
call, something mysterious about the ransom note. Are these clues that could help unmask a killer?
Put it, the physical setup of the note is another detail that resists common sense. Patsy described the 3 pages as laid out side by side on the step. But if the sheets were placed parallel, The only way to read them in sequence would be to move around, step over, or bend low, adjust position to catch the correct orientation. That footwork itself shows intent. Whoever arranged the note wanted it displayed, not just left. It wasn't crumpled, tossed, or hidden. It was staged for visibility. Now, if the reaction truly was fear of contaminating evidence, don't touch it, then the alternative actions should have been immediate and practical. Switch on the light. Call out JonBenét's name. Confirm the house before believing the worst. Those basic steps come before accepting the document's authority. Instead, the content was accepted instantly, without cross-checking the physical world against the written claim. That's the micro-logic problem. The placement of the pages demanded engagement, either touch them, or maneuver physically to read them. But the follow-up behaviors didn't match. There was neither careful reading nor careful searching. Only immediate surrender to the message, abduction. And that surrender is what makes investigators pause. Because once you strip away the panic, the sequence of actions makes less sense than the note itself. The ransom note may be the most theatrical artifact in this case, but the 911 call is the most fragile. It lasts less than a minute, it is curt, and it is riddled with silences. And yet, when you slow it down, amplify, and filter, the call begins to whisper things no one wanted to hear. The call was logged at 05:52 am. Patsy placed it just before 6, barely 3 hours after the supposed deadline in the ransom note. The content of the call is sparse. She gives the dispatcher her name, her address, and says, "We have a kidnapping. Hurry, please." Then silence. Within less than a minute, the line goes dead. What stands out is what's missing. No detailed description of JonBenét, her age, her clothing, her last known location. No mention of a possible entry point, no description of the note's demands. In crisis, parents often over-explain. They spill detail. Patsy didn't. The call feels less like a for help than like checking a box. Later, with audio enhancement technology, experts claim to hear additional voices at the tail end of the call. A faint male voice. A childlike phrase, "What did you find?" If true, that would shatter the Ramsey's central claim that Burke was asleep until police arrived. The presence of a child's voice doesn't prove involvement, but it proves awareness. If Burke was awake, close enough to be captured on the open phone line, then the narrative collapses. Why was his presence minimized? Why wasn't he mobilized immediately into the search? Why was he shielded from questioning in those first critical hours? The enhanced audio raises these questions, and no version of the family story resolves them. Another strange absence: no one calls out JonBenét's name. During the 911 call, during the commotion afterward, neighbors did not report hearing JonBenét echo through the house. In many abduction cases, parents shout, hoping the child is hiding, hoping she will answer. Here, the silence is notable. This silence mirrors behaviors seen in other cases when a perpetrator avoids calling a victim's name because they already know there will be no response. It's a subtle behavioral clue, one that prosecutors love but defense attorneys crush as speculation. Still, when added to the other paradoxes, it deepens the sense that instinctive behaviors were overridden. The dispatcher later said the line wasn't hung up cleanly. She felt someone was still on the other end, breathing. That matters. In standard protocol, operators keep callers talking. Longer calls, more details, clearer assessment. Here the call was cut short. The choice to terminate early altered the tempo of everything that followed. Police arrived at a scene not fully framed, to a narrative already constrained. Cutting the call short also affected scene preservation. The dispatcher wasn't able to instruct them to isolate the note, to avoid contaminating surfaces, to restrict movement. Instead, friends and neighbors soon filled the house, tramping through potential evidence. A longer call could have changed that. But the call ended in under a minute. The 911 call, like the ransom note, is a prism. On the surface, it looks routine: mother reports abduction. But under enhancement, under behavioral comparison, it fractures. A child's voice that shouldn't be there. A silence where a name should be. A hang-up where guidance should have continued. As 2320 framed it back in 1998.
Call. Something mysterious about the ransom note. Are these clues that could help unmask a killer? Are these clues that could help unmask a killer?
The call doesn't solve the case, but it destabilizes the official version. And when the official version is unstable, every other piece of evidence has to be re-examined through that crack. One of the most haunting details in the Ramsey case didn't come from inside the house at all. It came from a neighbor. Around midnight, sometime between 1200 and 100 am, she reported hearing a child scream, a sharp, terrified cry that jolted her enough to notice. She said her bedroom window was open 2 inches. Cold winter air carried the sound in. She remembered it. She told the police. And yet, inside the Ramsey house, no one reported hearing anything. Not John, not Patsy, not Burke. The family maintained the night was silent until Patsy came down the stairs and saw the note. That's the paradox. A scream so piercing that it reached a neighbor's partially opened window, but apparently failed to travel through the very walls where it was born. Investigators had to ask, how is that possible? The Ramsey home was large and layered. Multiple floors, twisting staircases, closed doors, heavy wood construction. JonBenét's room was at one end of the house. Her parents' bedroom was at another. Burke's room sat tucked away as well. Distance and architecture could dampen sound. A scream might not carry the way we imagine, but the counterpoint is obvious. Houses aren't soundproof. A sudden, panicked shriek, especially in the dead quiet of winter night, normally cuts through walls, through floors. Parents often hear their children cry out in sleep from across a hall. That's instinct, it's biology. Here nothing. There are possible variables. Televisions left on in the background. A furnace running, common in December. Closed bedroom doors. These could mask sound. But masking a scream is different from masking casual noise. One neighbor heard it outside, through winter air, at a distance. Inside, where walls should funnel sound, there was no acknowledgement. That gap is hard to reconcile. The scream report was never dismissed. It remained in the case file as an anomaly. For some investigators, it suggested the attack happened around midnight, not closer to morning. That timeline conflicts with the Ramseys' narrative of discovering the note just before 6. If JonBenét screamed between 12 and 1, then the household lived 5 more hours before the 911 call. 5 hours of silence. 5 hours unaccounted for. The central investigative question is brutal. If the neighbor could hear her, why didn't her family? Were they too far removed, doors closed, ears dulled by sleep? Or did someone hear and simply not respond? The midnight scream remains one of the starkest divides in this case. It forces us to confront the contradictions between external witnesses and internal silence. If true, it locks the crime to a window of time when everyone in the house was present. And it leaves us with a disturbing possibility. The cry for help was real, but the only people close enough to save her either didn't hear it or chose not to act. The ransom note was written on a notepad taken from the family kitchen. The ink flowed from a Sharpie, also found in the house. The garrote handle, a crude wooden stick, came from a broken paintbrush taken from Patsy's art supplies. These weren't foreign objects planted in the basement, they were domestic items repurposed into instruments of restraint and death. Tape and cord complicate things further. Rolls of duct tape and lengths of cord were found, but investigators never pinned their origin directly to the household. Unlike the Sharpie and the paintbrush, these items couldn't be definitively matched. But their generic quality, nothing exotic, nothing rare, meant that if they weren't from inside, they could easily have been carried in unnoticed. The forensic fibers add weight. 4 strands found on the adhesive tape across JonBenét's mouth were microscopically consistent with the black and red checked blazer that Patsy owned. Fiber matches aren't as absolute as DNA, but they're not trivial either. They point to proximity. If tape pressed against a child's skin carries fibers that link back to a parent's jacket, then at minimum, the jacket was present during a critical moment. The paradox again sharpens. Almost everything that mattered was already in the house. That fact cuts against the idea of a stealth intruder bringing tools in a bag. Instead, it fits a scene where improvisation took hold, where someone used what was at hand. In forensic analysis, investigators often ask a basic question: did the offender bring tools? Or did they use what they found? Offenders who improvise typically act under pressure, in familiar surroundings. Offenders who plan usually arrive equipped. The Ramsey crime scene tilts toward improvisation. A paintbrush handle snapped. Pages torn from a kitchen pad. A Sharpie left in plain sight. These are choices of convenience, not foresight. If an intruder slipped into that house, how likely is it that they bypassed their own equipment, instead hunting around for household items while a family slept upstairs? That scenario strains logic. By contrast, if the offender was already in the home, with time to select and use what was available, the picture grows more coherent. The tools from within the argument don't prove guilt, but it reshapes probability. Forensic reconstruction also looked at the time required for each stage. Writing a 3-page ransom note, even in haste, takes at least 15-20 minutes. Breaking a paintbrush, fashioning a garrote, applying tape and cord all add minutes more. If an intruder did all this after entering, the timeline expands dangerously. Every extra minute increased the risk of being discovered. Meanwhile, the neighbors reported hearing a scream around midnight. If that scream marked the beginning of violence, then at least 5 hours passed before the 911 call. That gap is crucial. An intruder improvising with tools inside the house would need to work quickly. A family member inside the house would not face the same risk. They had time. They had cover. The fibers found on the tape may be the smallest piece, but they carry outsized weight. Investigators highlighted 4 red-black strands as consistent with Patsy's blazer. Defense attorneys argued contamination fibers transfer easily in households. But context matters. These weren't random fibers on a sofa cushion. They were stuck to tape pressed onto a child's face. No direct explanation reconciles that detail. Patsy herself admitted she touched JonBenét during the frantic hours that morning, but that was after the tape had been removed. The forensic implication remains unresolved, either coincidence, contamination, or proximity at a critical earlier stage. The crime scene tells a story not just of violence, but of access. Tools from within, fibers linking clothing, time that favored someone already inside. Each element, on its own, can be argued away. Together, they form a pattern that pulls the crime back into the household. The paradox continues to expand. If the ransom note called for a world outside, the tools of the crime kept pulling the evidence back in. And in that clash between external threat and internal reality, the case has remained trapped for nearly 3 decades. One of the central pillars of the intruder hypothesis is the basement window. It was broken. John Ramsey himself admitted he had previously did to gain entry after locking himself out. That damage became the supposed point of entry and exit for an unknown offender. But then came the webs. Officers reported seeing cobwebs intact in the corners of the well and around the frame. If those webs truly were undisturbed, then the chance of an intruder climbing through that night collapses. The logic is simple. You cannot slide through a narrow basement opening without disrupting spider silk. Yet the record here is maddeningly incomplete. No photographs were taken of the webs in situ. It became a verbal note, not a visual one. That gap in documentation left years of argument wide open. Lou Smith, the detective who most forcefully pushed the intruder theory, insisted the window was viable. He even staged demonstrations, showing that someone could slip through without much effort. Critics countered that the undisturbed webs and the lack of debris tracked inward pointed to the opposite. In forensic terms, this is the case's Schrodinger's window, simultaneously an open door to an intruder and a sealed wall, depending on which record you trust. If the webs were intact, the intruder theory falters badly. If they weren't, then the absence of a photo is one of the Boulder Police Department's most costly failures. Even if you grant the possibility of an intruder slipping inside, the time study works against it. The offender would have had to enter quietly, avoiding alerting anyone in a 3-level house. Locate writing materials in the kitchen. Compose not just a draft, but a 3-page ransom note polished enough to be left behind. Hunt for tools, duct tape, cord, and a paintbrush to break for a garrote. Confront JonBenét, subdue her, and carry out the assault. Stage her body in the basement, wrapping, binding, arranging. Exit the house again without disturbing anyone. Each step adds time, and each minute compounds risk. Writing the note alone could have taken 20 minutes or more. Searching for tools and improvising a garrote adds more. Staging the body adds still more. In total, the intruder would need upward of an hour, maybe 2 inside the home. All while my parents and a brother slept above. The sheer length of that sequence strains plausibility. Intruders work fast, exposure time is danger time. A stranger spending that long, moving freely, writing at the kitchen counter, and leaving behind a theatrical document is almost unheard of. The risk factor is enormous. Any creak of a stair, any sound from the basement, any flicker of light could have triggered awareness in the house. And yet, not one family member stirred. Not one noise was reported. That silence, paired with the elaborate time demand, makes the intruder timeline feel more like fiction than fact. When investigators turned to the medical examiner's report, they were hoping for clarity. What they found instead was a sequence of injuries that read more like a riddle. The head trauma, the marks on the neck, the damage to sensitive areas, all of it pointed to violence. But the order in which these events occurred, and the meaning behind them, became one of the most contested battlegrounds in the case. The most obvious finding was the severe head injury. A fracture nearly 8 inches long stretching across the head. A blow of that magnitude usually produces significant internal bleeding. Yet the autopsy showed only about 7 cubic centimeters of blood inside the cranial cavity, barely more than a teaspoon. For a fracture of this scale, that amount was unusually small. Pathologists studying the report concluded the lack of bleeding meant one thing: circulation to the brain was already reduced when the head injury was delivered. In other words, the airway had been restricted first. The order seems reversed from what most people expect. Instead of a head strike followed by choking, the forensic picture suggests airway compression had already taken hold when the blow landed. That finding alters the psychology of the crime. If the head blow came after airway restriction, it may not have been the primary act of violence. Instead, it could have been reinforcement or even staging applied after the fact. Conversely, if the blow came first and was not instantly fatal, the airway compression could have been a follow-up to ensure death. Either way, the redundancy is telling. 2 separate lethal mechanisms were applied when one would have been enough. Redundancy in homicide usually signals panic, improvisation, or an attempt to mask the true cause of death.
Killed JonBenét Ramsey.
I did not have anything to do with it.
I did not kill my daughter JonBenét.
The grand jury is hearing the evidence in secret, but now we reveal startling that our sources say police found a child's scream on the fateful night, a surprising voice on the 911 call, something mysterious about the ransom note.
Another puzzle, despite the fracture's size, the scalp above it showed no tearing, no external bleeding, no obvious surface injury. To any pathologist, that stands out. Normally, a blow that splits bone also damages the skin above it. Two explanations exist. One is physiological. Children's scalps are elastic, capable of stretching more than an adult's. That elasticity might allow the tissue to absorb the force without tearing. The second explanation involves the weapon. If the surface that struck her was broad and smooth, something like the flat side of a heavy flashlight, it could crack bone without cutting skin. Investigators quietly tested this theory. They noted a Maglite flashlight in the house matched the dimensions needed. The flashlight itself had been wiped clean, down to the batteries. No prints, no smudges. Wiping batteries is not an accident, it suggests deliberate cleaning. That detail fed into suspicion, because if the object truly was innocent, why strip it of all trace? The absence of scalp trauma also rules against a fall. Falls usually create irregular fracture lines with surface bruising. Here, the fracture was clean, deliberate, and paired with neck compression. The autopsy's conclusion was blunt: this was intentional force. The report also noted damage to sensitive tissue in the lower body, consistent with recent contact from a foreign object. The bruising was fresh, not from past injury. Examiners proposed that part of a paintbrush, the same one broken to create the tightening device for the cord, could have been used. What makes this finding critical is not just the trauma, but the context. No outside DNA was found. No semen, no genetic material from an intruder. Only fibers and trace particles. That absence raised two competing theories. One, that the injury was inflicted as staging, an act meant to misdirect, to suggest an outside offender with a corrupt motive. Two, that an assault was attempted but interrupted. Either way, the common denominator is the tool. The paintbrush appears twice in the autopsy, once as part of the neck device, and once as a suspected instrument of contact injury. Two uses of the same household item, tied together by proximity. The implications were devastating. If staging, then someone inside the house intentionally injured a dead or dying child to sell a false story. If real assault, then the offender had time and access to escalate beyond a single lethal act. Both scenarios contradict the idea of a quick, clean break-in by a stranger. The order of injuries is more than academic. It reflects the state of mind. A seasoned intruder usually moves with speed, neutralize the victim, escape. One action decisive. A layered sequence: airway compression, head trauma, then foreign object contact suggests hesitation, panic, and overcorrection. It suggests someone who lingered. The airway compression appears first, starving the brain of blood flow. The head injury followed, but without normal hemorrhage. The contact injury appears last, perhaps as staging or escalation. This isn't a single strike, it's a series. Forensic psychologists interpret this kind of sequence as improvisational. Not preplanned, not methodical. Instead, reactive. Each act covers the last. Each injury adds complexity. That complexity is one reason the case has stayed unsolved. The crime scene doesn't line up with a simple intruder narrative, but neither does it pin itself neatly on a family member. It sits in between, forcing observers to interpret. The injuries don't give us a name, but they do point to setting. Tools from within the house, absence of foreign DNA, an offender with time to improvise, not rush, redundancy in methods, a sequence that reads as layered rather than singular. And just as the ransom note pulled suspicion outward, the injuries pulled it inward. The body itself contradicted the story on the paper. The paper said, abduction. The body said, staged violence inside the house. That clash between text and tissue is why the Ramsey case still burns almost 3 decades later. Forensic evidence doesn't close it, it fractures it further. The medical examiner could prove the existence of a severe head fracture, but not the exact object that caused it. That left investigators to piece together possibilities based on dimensions, surface qualities, and household context. One candidate was the Maglite flashlight found in the Ramsey kitchen. Its length and cylindrical surface matched the width of the fracture. A heavy strike with such a flashlight could split bone without cutting the scalp, exactly what the autopsy described. Suspicion deepened when investigators realized the flashlight had been wiped clean even though the batteries bore no fingerprints. That kind of meticulous cleaning suggested foreknowledge, not casual handling. Other possibilities were raised. A golf club, common in the Ramsey household, could deliver similar force. But most clubs have angled or textured heads, which should have left distinct patterns or scalp tearing. None were documented. Another theory pointed to a lightweight aluminum bat or rod. Aluminum strikes with enough power to fracture bone, and its round, uniform surface can create internal damage without ripping skin. A neighbor even reported hearing a sharp clank sound during the night of metallic impact, though the timing and location remain uncertain. No single weapon was ever confirmed. Each candidate had strengths, but none carried forensic residue tying it directly to the crime. What they shared, however, was proximity. All were household objects, already inside or just outside the Ramsey home. To understand the cause of death, pathologists studied not just the fracture but the micro-evidence. One crucial indicator, petechiae. These pinpoint hemorrhages, found in the eyes and lungs, occur when circulation continues under pressure. Their presence confirmed JonBenét was still breathing when airway compression was applied. She was alive, struggling for air. That matters. It means the head fracture, as brutal as it was, did not instantly kill. Medical experts concluded she might have survived if given emergency treatment. The airway compression was the ultimate act, the mechanism that ended life. The sequence, then, becomes sharper. The blow left her unconscious but not beyond saving. The tightening of the cord sealed her fate. It was not a single decisive attack, but a layered process where one injury could have been survivable. The other made it final. For investigators, this detail cut against the idea of a swift, opportunistic intruder. A quick killer doesn't linger. Here, the offender not only lingered but doubled down, ensuring death by adding redundancy. That decision reveals state of mind, caution, fear of discovery, or deliberate staging. The Ramsey case has always been haunted not only by evidence but by behavior. What people did, or didn't do, in the critical hours between Christmas night and the morning discovery, matters as much as the forensic record. When actions don't follow instinct, investigators ask why. By most accounts, the Ramseys returned home around 9 p.m. after a Christmas gathering. JonBenét had fallen asleep in the car. Patsy later carrying her upstairs, placing her in bed without waking her. This was the last moment her parents consistently claimed to have seen her alive. But even here, small contradictions creep in. Patsy told some interviewers the bedroom door was left closed after putting JonBenét to bed. In others, she described it as ajar. A closed door suggests deliberate sealing off, safety. Ajar suggests accessibility. The contradiction may sound trivial, but in investigative logic, such details matter. They shape whether an intruder theory feels plausible. The night, by their telling, was otherwise uneventful. Everyone went to bed. No noises reported. No disturbances. Yet neighbors later recalled hearing a child scream around midnight. That outside testimony clashed directly with the family's account of uninterrupted sleep. At approximately 5:30 a.m., Patsy awoke, by her version, to prepare for an early trip. On the back staircase, she reported finding the ransom note, 3 pages, written on their notepad, in their home. Her reaction was immediate and dramatic. She read only the opening lines, "We have your daughter." She screamed. She ran to John. Within minutes, she dialed 911. The call itself was short, clipped, and ended abruptly. There was no attempt to calm herself enough to give a full description of JonBenét, no details of clothing or last sighting, no mention of entry points. The dispatcher later recalled, "It didn't feel right. Something was off." Even more curious, neither John nor Patsy shouted their daughter's name inside the house. "No JonBenét!" ringing through hallways, no urgent sweep of bedrooms or closets. They accepted the note's message at face value. She had been taken, therefore she was not in the house. That reflex shaped everything that followed. And then there was Burke. By both John and Patsy's statements, he was left asleep until police arrived. Hours passed before he was even aware of the crisis. Yet audio enhancement of the 911 call suggested his voice may have been audible, faint but present, asking, "What did you find?" If that enhancement is accurate, the narrative collapses. Burke was awake, possibly nearby, at the very moment his parents claimed he was unconscious in bed. Behavioral analysis often uses search logic as a test of credibility. What would a reasonable parent do upon finding a ransom note? The expected sequence is straightforward. Call the child's name loudly throughout the house. Sweep room by room, bedroom, siblings' room, kitchen, playroom, basement. Check closets, under beds, unusual spaces where a child might hide. Cross-reference belongings. Is her bicycle in the garage, her favorite toy missing, her pet where it should be? Only after exhausting these steps would parents assume abduction. That is the gold standard, the internal investigative routine most families follow naturally, even before police arrive. The Ramseys' version diverged sharply. They skipped straight to belief in abduction. They did not perform a systematic search before dialing 911. They did not call her name. They allowed friends into the house, contaminating the scene. John later searched the basement but only after officers suggested he look around. And when he opened the storage room where JonBenét's body lay, it was nearly noon, more than 6 hours after the call. That gap between expected and actual behavior is a core reason suspicion lingered. Investigators could not reconcile the family's calm acceptance of the note with the instinctive chaos most parents would unleash. The behavioral timeline paints a picture that is less about what was done and more about what wasn't. No midnight disturbances reported inside, though a neighbor heard a scream. No urgent search, though a note threatened a child's life. No calling the child's name, though every parent knows that's the first response. And a boy allegedly asleep until late morning, though enhanced audio may have caught his voice earlier. And it is in those contradictions, more than in any fiber or footprint, that the Ramsey case continues to fracture. The Ramsey case has always served from a central paradox. The violence wasn't linear. It didn't unfold like a single, decisive act. Instead, the injuries suggest layers of restriction of the airway that required sustained force, and a head fracture that happened in a sudden blow. Those two types of action are nearly contradictory. One requires time and willpower, the other happens in an instant. Out of this contradiction grew a theory that has shadowed the case for years: the possibility of two perpetrators. Medical evidence shows signs of prolonged neck compression, consistent with a device fashioned from cord and wood. That act alone would take sustained effort, minutes of pressure, focus, and physical control. It's not a momentary strike, it's persistence. At nearly the same time, an explosive blow fractured the skull. The fracture extended nearly 8 inches, requiring considerable force. If one offender carried out both actions, the sequence becomes difficult to explain. Why maintain pressure while also delivering a heavy strike? Why not one method alone? The overlap of two different types of violence suggests two actors, one focused on immobilizing, the other on silencing or finishing. Investigators have long debated this. Could a single person have switched methods midstream? Possibly. But the lack of blood in the cranial cavity implies that circulation was already restricted when the blow fell. That means the two actions were close together, perhaps nearly simultaneous. Forensic psychologists read that overlap as a potential indicator of multiple hands at work. If two people were involved, the mechanics start to align more clearly. Imagine a fender positioned near the head, applying force with the makeshift tightening device. This role required holding tension, leaning weight into the cord, and maintaining pressure for long minutes. Meanwhile, offender B could act independently, reaching for whatever was closest at hand. The aluminum bat or rod, often discussed as a candidate weapon, fits this profile. Its smooth, rounded surface could cause the type of fracture seen without scalp tearing. And if JonBenét, even briefly conscious, tried to shift or crawl, offender B's instinct might have been to strike downward quickly, forcefully, aiming to stop noise. That single downward blow could silence her instantly, while offender A continued to hold the device in place. This division of labor explains several paradoxes. It explains why there were two different lethal mechanisms. It explains why the fracture showed minimal bleeding circulation already cut off. And it explains the apparent redundancy: two people acting at once, each ensuring silence in their own way. Why would two people act together? One possibility is panic. If a confrontation began accidentally, two individuals might have reacted simultaneously, one restraining, the other striking. Another possibility is staging. After initial harm, a second person added violence to disguise intent. In cases of family cover-ups, two perpetrator scenarios are not rare. One adult manages control while another stages a scene. Or, in sibling cases, a parent intervenes after a child lashes out. These are uncomfortable scenarios, but they match forensic timelines better than the intruder narrative. Critics argue the theory complicates an already convoluted case. Why assume two when one could suffice? But defenders counter: the injuries themselves are the complication. One person improvising might have stopped after airway restriction, or after a head blow. The coexistence of both, so closely timed, is what keeps suspicion alive. Adding to this is the testimony of a neighbor who recalled hearing a metallic clank. At the time, it was dismissed as background noise. But in hindsight, it aligns with the hypothesis of a metallic rod or bat being used. A smooth aluminum surface matches the forensic profile. And if that sound did occur around midnight, it corresponds chillingly with the neighbor's report of a scream in the same window of time. Together, scream plus metallic impact form a snapshot: a child in distress, a quick silencing strike, while another force continues to restrain. It is speculative, but it fuses external witness reports with forensic detail. If two perpetrators acted, the implications ripple outward. It means the crime was not the work of a single intruder, slipping in and out unseen. It means at least two people were present in the moment of violence. In a household of three awake individuals, mother, father, brother, that conclusion grows heavy. It also reframes the ransom note. A 3-page performance suddenly looks less like a lone actor's creation and more like a joint effort, a collaborative staging. One voice rating, another supporting. Control of the narrative becomes as divided as control of the body. If two perpetrators acted, the implications ripple outward. It means the crime was not the work of a single intruder, slipping in and out unseen. It means at least two people were present in the moment of violence. In a household of three awake individuals, mother, father, brother, that conclusion grows heavy. It also reframes the ransom note. A 3-page performance suddenly looks less like a lone actor's creation and more like a joint effort, a collaborative staging. One voice writing, another supporting. Control of the narrative becomes as divided as control of the body. The two-perpetrator hypothesis does not resolve the Ramsey case. But it answers why the violence looks redundant, why the injuries overlap, why the behavior doesn't align with a clean intruder script. It introduces the possibility that two people, in panic or collusion, acted in tandem that night. The injuries suggest more than one pair of hands. And if that's true, the circle of suspicion tightens to access not only to the child, but to each other. The positioning of JonBenét's body added another layer of ambiguity. She was found with her arms raised above her head tilted slightly. Some pathologists noted that this posture could have allowed the tightening device around her neck to pull tighter during her final moments. In a panic, struggling, she may have pulled against it herself, causing additional constriction beyond what the offender applied directly. That detail complicates the mechanics. It suggests that even if only one person held the cord, the force might have been intensified unintentionally through her own movement. But the rest of the scene points to orchestration. The blanket draped over her, the careful arrangement of the cord and handle, the deliberate placement in a small basement room. These weren't the acts of someone rushing out a window. They looked like staging choices made when there was time, not danger. The positioning of JonBenét's body added another layer of ambiguity. She was found with her arms raised above her head tilted slightly. Some pathologists noted that this posture could have allowed the tightening device around her neck to pull tighter during her final moments. In a panic, struggling, she may have pulled against it herself, causing additional constriction beyond what the offender applied directly. That detail complicates the mechanics. It suggests that even if only one person held the cord, the force might have been intensified unintentionally through her own movement. But the rest of the scene points to orchestration. The blanket draped over her, the careful arrangement of the cord and handle, the deliberate placement in a small basement room. These weren't the acts of someone rushing out a window. They looked like staging choices made when there was time, not danger. The violence carried hallmarks of overkill. To pathologists, overkill usually points to either rage or multiple actors. A single offender might strangle or strike, but both together feel excessive. With two people, though, the overlap makes more sense. One restrains while the other strikes. One panics while the other silences. And staging after the fact could also be divided. One person could draft the ransom note, while another placed or wiped down objects. The matte light, cleaned of fingerprints. The paintbrush, broken into two separate tools. That distribution of tasks would shorten the time needed, fitting better with the timeline than if one person had managed everything alone. Even the metallic clank heard by the neighbor fits. If an aluminum bat or rod was used, it may have been tossed away immediately after the scream to the ground outside or into storage. That sound, coinciding with a scream, echoes like a fragment of the truth cutting through the night. If two perpetrators acted, the hardest question remains: who were they? Was it two family members, acting in panic or collusion? Or a blend of family and outsider, one inside, one slipping in? The evidence doesn't name them. It only shows the possibility of more than one set of hands. Another open question: what level of intent governed the night? Was the initial act deliberate, or did it begin as panic? If panic came first, staging may have followed, with decisions made in cold calculation after the fact. If intent was primary, then the note and staging were premeditated, designed before violence began. And then the ultimate fracture in the narrative: was the staging done by the same pair who inflicted the injuries, or by one afterward, covering for another? The ransom note, the arranged body, the missing fingerprints, they could all be the work of staging layered on top of violence. As unsettling as it sounds, the scene does not answer these questions cleanly. It only raises them, leaving investigators and the public trapped in the same paradox. The Ramsey case didn't just play out in a home and a courtroom, it unfolded on television screens and in press conferences. What shaped the public perception as much as any fiber or footprint was the way the media framed the story, and the way investigators and prosecutors fought each other behind the scenes. By the late 1990s, two competing narratives dominated: the Ramsey family's own self-presentation and the media's selective spotlight on startling new evidence. In 1998, the Ramseys participated in a documentary titled JonBenét is America. For the first time, they put themselves in front of cameras to tell their version of the story. The result was narrative control. By speaking directly, they bypassed law enforcement commentary and reframed themselves as bewildered parents trapped in a nightmare. The documentary emphasized their shock upon finding the ransom note. They repeated the line, "We didn't know what to do." But critics noted that wasn't true. John Ramsey was a CEO experienced in crisis management, skilled at navigating pressure. Patsy was trained in public performance from years in pageants. Both knew how to manage perception. Their decision to go public wasn't about confusion, it was about steering the story, and the speed with which they accepted the note as authentic reflected that control. Rather than show doubt or retrace steps, or search systematically, they adopted the note's narrative wholesale. An intruder had taken their child. JonBenét is America gave that narrative a polished platform, reinforcing the family as victims, not suspects. The program lined up element investigators had struggled with: the neighbor's report of a midnight scream, the enhanced audio that suggested Burke's voice, fibers linking Patsy's blazer to the tape, the makeshift tools drawn from household items, the cobweb question at the basement window, and the intruder time study showing how implausible it was for a stranger to linger so long undetected. By presenting these details together, 2020 did what police could not. It made the circumstance feel direct. For the viewing public, it was less about lab reports and more about logic. And logic leaned towards suspicion inside the house. By presenting these details together, did what police could not. It made the circumstance feel direct. For the viewing public, it was less about lab reports and more about logic. And logic leaned towards suspicion inside the house. Behind the cameras, the system fractured. Detective Steve Thomas, a lead investigator, grew openly frustrated with District Attorney Alex Hunter. Thomas believed the evidence, though circumstantial, pointed strongly at the family. Hunter resisted, arguing that without direct physical proof, any prosecution would collapse. The tension exploded when Thomas resigned in 1998. His resignation letter condemned the DA's office, accusing Hunter of bending to political and public pressure. Thomas argued the case had been sabotaged by fear of prosecuting wealthy, high-profile parents. Hunter countered that Thomas was reckless, blinded by tunnel vision. This clash filtered directly into the grand jury process the same year. Jurors reviewed volumes of evidence, heard testimony, and reportedly voted to indict at least one parent. Yet Hunter refused to sign the indictment, citing insufficient evidence to sustain a conviction. The case stalled, suspended in limbo between police insistence and prosecutorial caution. What these battles exposed was a structural flaw in American justice: the gap between circumstantial and direct evidence. Circumstantial evidence can be powerful fibers, behaviors, timelines, but in a courtroom, it requires unanimity. Jurors must see the lines converge on one clear suspect. In the Ramsey case, the lines diverged. Some pointed inward, some outward. And without DNA or fingerprints to close the gap. For the public, this became infuriating. On TV, the evidence looked overwhelming. In court, it looked porous. The result was paralysis. The media framed the case as solvable. The legal system framed it as unsustainable. The Ramsey story in the late 1990s wasn't just about a crime. It was about narrative control and institutional breakdown. The family used the media to humanize themselves. Programs like 20 to 20 dramatized the circumstantial web. And inside the system, detectives and prosecutors tore each other apart, leaving a grand jury indictment unsigned and a community convinced justice had been stalled. This friction between media, police, prosecutors, and law remains one of the most enduring shadows over the case. It's why, nearly 3 decades later, the name JonBenét Ramsey still evokes not only tragedy, but also mistrust in the very institutions meant to deliver the truth. After laying out the paradoxes, suspicions, and possible reconstructions, it is necessary to pause. Any analysis of the Ramsey case must reckon, not only with what the evidence might suggest, but also with the limits of that evidence. For every claim that points inward, there exists a counterpoint. For every suspicion, there is an alternative explanation. Without acknowledging these counterarguments, the narrative risks distortion. The claim that Burke's voice was captured at the end of the 911 call is one of the most provocative in the entire file. Yet it is not an uncontested fact. Audio enhancement is prone to artifacts, distortions, echoes, or imagined words that seem present once suggested. Critics note that human perception is suggestible once a child's voice says, "What did you find?" It becomes difficult to unhear it. Others argue the supposed words could just as easily be background noise or cross-channel static. In short, while intriguing, they not be treated as hard evidence. Don Foster, the text analyst, dissected the ransom note's syntax, punctuation, and phrasing. He pointed to oddities such as overuse of exclamation marks and borrowed movie language. But his work was not a handwriting study. Textual analysis is interpretive, not scientific. Two analysts may read the same sentence differently. Defense attorneys would argue that style alone cannot tie a note to any one person, and that Foster's claims are more literary criticism than forensic proof. Thus, the note remains suspicious, but not determinative. The web evidence is another fragile piece. Officers claimed cobwebs near the basement window were undisturbed, undermining the intruder theory. Yet no photographs exist. Without visual documentation, the claim rests only on memory and notes. A single observation, however sincere, lacks permanence in court. Defense attorneys could and did argue that absent photos, the cobweb argument carries little weight. In a case where nearly everything else is contested, this gap matters. The tape used on JonBenét carried fibers matching Patsy's blazer. On its face, this seems damning. But fiber evidence is rarely standalone proof. Fibers transfer easily in domestic environments, couches, car seats, laundry. Prosecutors ascribe fiber evidence as part of a mosaic, not a single tile. By itself, a match means little. Only when combined with other independent elements can it support a case. This point underscores why the DA resisted indictment. Without a complete mosaic, each fragment was too weak to hold in court. Finally, and most importantly, there is the ethical obligation in discussing this case. JonBenét Ramsey was a child. Her dignity must remain central, and speculation should never cross into exploitation. Equally, under law, every suspect remains innocent until proven guilty. No grand jury ever returned a signed indictment, and no court ever heard a trial. This means any reconstruction, whether intruder theory, family involvement, or two-perpetrator hypotheses, must be treated as analysis, not accusation. It is one thing to critique narrative inconsistencies, it is another to declare guilt. Responsible discussion requires restraint. The Ramsey case endures because it is built on uncertainty. Enhancement may be an artifact. Textual fingerprints may be misread. Cobwebs may have never been documented. Fibers may have transferred innocently. Every clue has a counter. Every theory has a fracture. The lesson here is twofold. That circumstantial evidence, however compelling, demands context, and that sensitivity, especially when a child's life is at the center, is not optional but essential. The paradox remains unsolved, but the way we speak about it must honor both truth and restraint. We've spent this entire breakdown tracing three pillars of what I've called the Ramsey paradox: the ransom note, the scream, and the 911 call. Now let's step back and connect them to the wider scene. The note, 3 pages long, written with the family's own pad and pen, carried no usable fingerprints from John or Patsy. A neighbor reported a child's scream just after midnight, yet no one inside the house ever called out JonBenét's name or searched systematically before dialing 911. The emergency call itself ended abruptly, with enhancement suggesting Burke's faint voice, even though his parents said he was asleep until police arrived. Then at the crime scene, almost every tool of violence came from within the home. A notepad and Sharpie from the kitchen. A paintbrush snapped for a cord device. Duct tape that could not be sourced but looked ordinary, domestic. Even fibers on the tape matched Patsy's clothing. Put that together with the time study, and the intruder theory begins to crumble. To pull this off, an outsider would have had to slip in, write a novel-length note, improvise tools, stage a scene, and exit unseen, all while a family slept upstairs. Possible, maybe. Plausible, much harder. But the Ramsey case is not about easy answers. It is about weighing contradictions, holding competing truths, and recognizing the limits of evidence. Now, I want to hand this back to you. 3 simple questions, yes or no, but explain why. The parents never called JonBenét's name before searching the house. Do you think that's a reasonable reaction in that situation? The ransom note carried no family fingerprints. Do you see that as coincidence or as a sign of deliberate avoidance? If nearly every tool came from inside the house, and the time required was extensive, is the intruder theory still credible to you? Call to action. Here's the challenge. Leave a comment with your answers. But don't stop at one line. Write at least 100 words. Lay out your reasoning, your doubts, your alternate angle. I'll pin the best long response at the top so everyone can weigh it. And I'll also put up a yes/no poll on the core question: intruder or family-centric. Cast your vote. Numbers matter. Finally, if you lean toward the two-perpetrator hypothesis, tell me your theory. Who do you think the pair could have been, and why? What in the timeline or evidence convinces you? Because in the end, this isn't just my analysis. It's a collective investigation, an audience-driven re-examination of a case that has resisted closure for almost 3 decades. So, go deep long. Vote yes or no. And share your version of the truth hidden in the paradox. But here's the haunting truth. After nearly 3 decades, no courtroom has ever heard this evidence in full sequence. Instead, we've been left with fragments. The ransom note staged like theater. A midnight scream heard outside but silenced inside. A 911 call that may have carried more voices than anyone admitted. Each fragment, on its own, could be dismissed. Together, they form a pattern that refuses to fade. And maybe that's what we all missed. The case was never just about fingerprints or fibers. It was about human behavior under pressure. The silences, the shortcuts, the contradictions, those are the fingerprints left on the soul of this story. If the basement walls could talk, they wouldn't whisper about an intruder. They would ask why the answers have always been right here, hidden in plain sight.